Another test review. There is not much about this unit that I'd call easy, but the dates really are easier. They're also important. Basically, in Italy, the Proto-Renaissance period is the 14th century or the 1300s. The early Renaissance is the 15th century or 1400s. Note that the lives of Cosimo de' Medici and his grandson Lorenzo pretty much span this century, and that it opens with the Bronze Door competition and more or less closes with Leonardo da Vinci. Leonardo is usually classed as a high Renaissance painter, but really The Last Supper falls right on the cusp. The Northern Renaissance is contemporaneous with the early Italian Renaissance, but somewhat confusingly, unlike the most early Renaissance painters, Northern Renaissance painters use oils. The first half of the 1500s or the 16th century is the time of the High Renaissance and our superstars. Note how these dates are clumped together in the first few decades of the 16th century. The Reformation also begins in these years and spreads throughout Northern Europe during the 16th century. The Wars of Religion will end in 1648. That's next unit. So I borrowed this review slide from another teacher and then wasn't sure where to stick it. The test review seems a good place. These are all very important elements of both the Italian and Northern Renaissance. But there were some important differences as well, and this is a good summary that could help you with several of the questions. Okay, warning, there are a lot of matching questions for this unit, although there are no review questions, and in fact there are no review quizzes for this period. Artists are now much more important. You also need to know the difference between works in fresco, tempera, and oil. And then there are all those technique questions about perspective, painting, and printmaking. The good news is that every single matching question is already up on Moodle, and you can practice them as many times as you want before the test. Not every matching question will be on the test, and different classes may get different matching question sets. But overall, this is a great way to review this rich and crowded period. And I will give you one hint. I would not stint on artists. And in that spirit, there will be 5 attribution questions where we'll give you a work that you probably haven't seen and ask you to attribute to an artist or to an art historical period, such as the High Italian Renaissance. So, who painted this scene on the Rhone River at night? Well, probably the same guy who painted Starry Night, right? Vincent van Gogh. They share an expressionist vision of the night sky, strong, loose, and swirling and parallel brushstrokes, and even a color scheme. You will see more attribution questions like these in future units, again, because the work of individual artists is becoming more important. What are the qualities that set Venetian paintings apart from other Renaissance paintings, including, by the way, Venetian paintings by this artist whom you need to know? Who was an important 16th century patron of the art? This portrait by Raphael should be a very huge hint. Okay, you know the drill for these questions. The nudity of this figure harks back to what era? Well, you all know this, right? So why weren't nude sculptures made between the classical era and the early Renaissance? Well, one reason is that they generally depicted pagan gods, and the church frowned on any suggestions of paganism during the early Christian and medieval periods. The church was also less inclined to celebrate the human body, more committed to celibacy and sexual purity. One of these is going to be the right answer. I'd note that some of the questions on these works come from recent practice tests, so the College Board expects you to know the work on the right, even though it's not on the list. Both sculptures depict whom? Both figures were produced where? Those should be easy. The pose of these figures goes by what term? How do both figures differ from medieval statuary? Both sculptures recall works from what earlier era? We've talked about some of this already. There will be some repetition. How does the work on the left revive classical interpretations of the male figure? How does the work on the right represent a high Renaissance ideal? By the way, I think you'll find all of these old AP questions easy to answer, probably easier than the questions you'll encounter on the new version of the test. But this one's a little tougher. What element makes the marble sculpture innovative? How does the sculptor choose to depict the subject somewhat differently? Think about the moment each artist chose to capture. I talked about this in my podcast. And a related question, actually a new one from the College Board. In what way could the sculpture on the right be seen as a response to the sculpture on the left? In other words, what is the difference besides medium in the way the artist chose to approach the subject? The sculpture on the left was moved twice. Where was it originally placed? To where was it moved before it was again moved to a museum? There are a lot of questions on this painting since I have questions from both the old and the new curriculum. I recommend you review your notes. So let's start with basics. It dates from the end of which century? Careful here, and remember what I said about keeping your early and high Renaissance artists and centuries straight. Who was the patron of the work? What is the central figure, or who is the central figure in the painting? That naked lady standing on the cockle shell. Her pose is derived from what earlier source? What made this central figure innovative for her time? The painting is noteworthy for its, you're going to fill in the blank, but I'm going to give you some hints. Recall that unlike many early Renaissance painters, Botticelli was not especially interested in mathematical perspective, geometry, or natural science, but he was a master of line. I don't think you'll find it hard to identify the correct answer, even if you ignore all of these hints. Who denounced this and other Botticelli paintings and may actually have persuaded Botticelli to destroy some of his works? Art historians are still debating that one. And here's one of my freebies for those of you who actually watch the test review. There's quite a bit of debate over the philosophical meaning of this painting, and there's a question about that. Some scholars believe that these paintings reflect Neoplatonism. The famous Medici Academy, for example, was also called the Platonic Academy. And here's a summary, and I'm going to admit it, it's from Wikipedia. For Plato and for the members of the Florentine Platonic Academy, Venus had two aspects. She was an earthly goddess who aroused humans to physical love, or she was a heavenly goddess who inspired an intellectual love. Plato further argued that contemplation of physical beauty allowed the mind to better understand spiritual beauty. That's a good excuse, huh? So looking at Venus, the most beautiful of goddesses, might at first raise a physical response in viewers, which then lifted their minds toward the creator. A Neoplatonic reading of Botticelli's Birth of Venus suggests that 15th century viewers would have looked at the painting and felt their minds lifted to the realm of divine love, not thinking about the fact she was a beautiful naked girl. Okay. Again, these are random questions that will appear in some form on the test. This is a repeat question for you and on AP Art History tests. Oops, I think that may be left over from earlier notes. This structure fell off the list, but I want you to know something about it. Who designed the dome and supervised its construction? And here's another freebie. It was a remarkable feat of engineering as well as design. Well, it's tricky fitting both of these paintings on one slide. They appeared together in an earlier AP set of image-based questions. Brancacci's tribute money on the upper left is no longer on the list, but I could imagine this question showing up anyway. Both artists are interested in using what techniques to depict their subjects. I'll give you a hint. Take a look at the architecture and see how it's used in each composition. What does it set off? Okay, again, there are lots of questions about this painting. What purpose did it serve? What two cultures or philosophical position did the patron hope to reconcile? Where was this fresco painted? And be careful, the answer is quite specific. What does this work have in common stylistically with Leonardo's Last Supper? And here's a hard one and a recent one from the College Board. The illusionist architecture of this scene is based on... Well, I talked about this in my podcast, but I think it's a very picky question since it does not refer back to a required work. The College Board thinks the answer is the Baths of Caracalla, so I'm giving you another freebie. Here's an image of the Baths of Caracalla and a 19th century imaginative reconstruction. Note the coffered ceiling that appeared in the School of Athens and, of course, in the ceiling of the Pantheon. Here are two details from the Merode altarpiece. How does this artist employ symbolism? What is this work, and what other required work features different architectural orders on different levels? Still more random questions. Note that some of these refer back to earlier units. Who is the artist and what innovations appear in his work? Some variations on this question used to show up in the AP exam almost every year, by the way, and it's likely to show up again. Note the scene painted over the main door. Which of our other required works portrays the same content? Why did the patron commission the chapel? What kinds of scenes are juxtaposed in the lamentation and its decorative border? All of the following have been interpreted as wedding symbols except, ouch, you really do need to know those symbols. This work was both dated and signed. Which other required work is also signed? And I'm going to give you a big hint. It is one of our Islamic works. Also, recent scholarship suggests that this might not be a portrait of a wedding. What else might the artist be recording? So why can this painting be attributed to Van Eyck? Sorry, the second image isn't better, but just think about the qualities of all Van Eyck paintings. What is the term for an altarpiece with a centerpiece and two flanking wings? What is the term for the lower portion of this altarpiece? And by the way, this kind of altarpiece was much more typical of the Northern Renaissance than the Italian Renaissance. The landscape we see through the window is an actual Florentine scene. The river is identifiably the Arno River. But what school of art influenced the artist? What other religious paintings employed vivid landscapes? There's another accept question that requires you to look closely at the work. How does the artist use shading and shadow? What kinds of personalities does he give his figures? What kinds of perspective does he use? Are there symbols in these paintings? How does this painting reflect a new Renaissance approach to depicting biblical figures and saints? Whew, this is not an easy test, but I've dropped a whole lot of hints and even given away some answers. Good luck.